Hello again. I have decided to switch gears on this episode and going from being Marianne the librarian to being Madam Nancy the palm reader, the psychic, the seer, and share that side of my life with you, which we haven't really touched on it up to this point. And when I was 3 years old in New Orleans, my aunt sent me a doll for my birthday. And my mother was home alone a lot with my father traveling. So she would read at night. She loved to read, and she didn't like to be she liked to stay up late. We were both always night owls. But two, she didn't like being alone in New Orleans in this deserted area with only three houses out by Lake Pontchartrain. So she would stay up and read. And she loved murder mysteries. She was into Agatha Christie and all the murder mysteries. And she had a new book. My father's out of town. Back in those days, people didn't call. We're talking like 1942, 44, 45, somewhere in there. I was born in 39, so 41, I guess we're talking like 43. And the book had a character in it with a strange name that wasn't something that you would typically hear in America, like Throckmorton or who knows what, but some English name that she was unfamiliar with. So she's reading her book. And the next day when I get up, she asked what I was going to call my doll. I gave my doll the name of this woman, this character in this Agatha Christie murder mystery. And my mother knew she hadn't talked to anyone on the phone. She hadn't mentioned it to me, and she started reading it in the middle of the night. So she knew the only way I could have gotten that name from her was if I had picked it up from her mind. And telepathy was not an unknown thing in our family. My great aunt, her aunt, my Aunt Goldie, who was my grandfather's sister, read tea leaves and was very good at reading tea leaves. And I always laughed because my very strict Southern Baptist grandmother, who was my aunt's sister-in-law, loved having her tea leaves read, which you wouldn't think she would have, but she did. So, and then one night in New Orleans, Mother heard something hit the window in the bathroom. She was getting ready for bed and something thumped. And she immediately said to my father, "Oh, grandmother is dead." And she knew that her grandmother had died at that instant. Well, it was the war years. People had party lines. You didn't make long distance calls like you do now and all. So she did not find out until sometime the next day when her father called her that her grandmother, who was in her 70s, had been walking up the stairs at a party, and somebody called to her. She turned around quickly, her heel caught in the rug, threw her down the stairs, and the next day she died. But she died right at the time that my mother heard this something thump on the window. And Daddy said, "Oh, it's a seagull." Mother said, "No, it's my grandmother. She just died." So the next thing that happened, my sister didn't say a word till she was a year old. And they were getting worried and thinking they needed to take her to a doctor and see why she wasn't talking. And all of a sudden, she starts talking in sentences. She said, "Nancy always knew what I wanted," which was true. I would go say, "My baby sister Betsy Lynn is hungry or wet or whatever." And I always knew. And she said, "I didn't have to talk. Nancy took care of me and knew what I wanted." So that was sort of the introduction to something beyond just the ordinary. Then when I moved to California, I had the chance to hear Dr. Ryan from Duke University talk about his experiments with cards and people who could predict which cards would be turned up next. And that fascinated me. I was very intrigued. But, and I do remember wandering through the shelves of the library once I worked there and knew how to find things on the shelf, trying to find out something about Lemuria and Atlantis. And Atlantis, you might occasionally hear about. We're talking the 50s now. But nobody ever talked about Lemuria, at least not in my circles. So I don't know why I'm thinking about these things. Then I moved to Atlanta. And a friend across the street. Her name was Bitsy Webb. She later became Mrs. Killian Townsend. And I'd been there a very short time. And she said, "Oh, we have to go out to see Madame Pauline, the palm reader, out the Beaufort Highway." And I'm like, "What?" And she said, "Everybody goes, all the businessmen downtown, everybody goes to see Madame Pauline. She lives in a trailer. So we drive, it's about an hour drive from where we were. We're down at Colonial Homes in Buckhead. And we drive out there, and there are cars lined up. You know, there's a whole line. We waited an hour for our turn. And it wasn't expensive. It was like $10 or $15 back then to get your palm read. And here's this woman from New Orleans, where I have a connection. And she's just telling you things from looking at your hand. And the things that stood out the most, she said, "You're going to get a long distance phone call offering you a job, and you'll be very pleased, and it's something you would like to do, but you won't feel you could do it right now. And this is coming in the next 3 months. And so you'll be pleased but disappointed over this opportunity." And yeah, and then she told me a few other things. And I go home thinking, I just got a job. I've only been here like about 6 weeks, and I don't have a clue who might be offering me a job somewhere that I would be pleased or disappointed. Well, sure enough, in that time frame, I come home from work one day, and there's a telegram under the door. And back in those days, people sent telegrams. And it was from the office of Fletcher Thompson, who was my Georgia congressman. I had not met him yet. And it was offering me a job in his office. Now, I love politics. I've always loved politics. I wore an "I like Ike" button when I was in 8th grade, for heaven's sakes. I've always been fascinated, probably because my father talked about it a lot at home. So his office wanted to hire me, sight unseen. Here's one of those, I told you, I never applied for my jobs. Most of them, I didn't even know they existed. And here comes this job offer. And it was my California congressman, Pete McCloskey, who had recommended me for this job. We were good friends. I had worked for his opponent, Shirley Temple Black, but he forgave me for that. And he was my congressman out there. And we became very good friends. In fact, to this day, we're still friends. Carmen and I are friends with him and his wife now. So he didn't have a wife at that time. He was divorced. So I called them, and they said, "Pete highly praised you, and we need this person, and you'd have to move to Washington." So here's the telegram said, "Call his office in DC." So there's that long distance phone call. They had tried unsuccessfully to reach me, so now they're sending the telegram. So I call his office, and they said they'd love to have me come work up there. And I said, "Well, I just moved here. I haven't been here 3 or 4 months. I haven't really even unpacked everything, and I can't turn around and leave Atlanta and teaching at Emory and setting up programs in the inner city area. I can't just turn around and leave. I'm thrilled and flattered that you all would offer me this, but no, thank you." So but then I started thinking, how did that woman know that? So being a librarian, I go look at the 133 section, which is metaphysics, and I find a book on palmistry. And I take it home, and I start studying what the different lines mean in your hand and the shape of your fingers in your hand and what have you. It all means something. So I started practicing. I'd be at a party. And when you're young and single, which I was then, it was a great way to get to hold some guy's hand and flirt a little while you're telling him things out of his head. But I tried to tell them things that I was really getting. I wasn't just BSing it. I was serious about this. So I remember one of the first ones was a guy. He was tall, dark, and handsome. And I look at him and I said, "I don't know where this is coming from, but this is what I see in your hand." And I described a car to him, the color, the style, the model, everything. He said that was my very first car in life. And I'm like, oh, and it wasn't the car he was driving then. And I don't even know what car he was driving then. I'm just meeting him at a party. And then the next thing I see, I said, "I have no idea what this means, but I see mashed potatoes around you, a big mound of mashed potatoes." He started laughing, and he said, At Thanksgiving one year, my mother asked me, I was about 9 or 10, and she asked me to help put the dishes on the table for the big Thanksgiving dinner. And one of the dishes I carried in was mashed potatoes, and I love mashed potatoes. So I picked up the spoon and tasted, and before I knew it, I'd eaten the entire bowl of mashed potatoes. He said my mother was furious. I got sent to my room with no turkey because I had eaten all the mashed potatoes and there were none for the dinner. And so that meant something to him. But I tell you, he said, well, which line said that? I said, I don't know which line said that. That is just what came into my head as I'm looking at your hand. And I found as I started talking to people and telling them things, I knew what the lines meant, the headline, the lifeline, what they were doing and all. But what was coming through wasn't anything that was in a line. And so I ended up reading poems for parties. I did it for a couple of political fundraisers. I did it for some social parties. And in the meantime, a man I knew here in Atlanta was part of a group studying metaphysics, and he took me to that group's Christmas party. And the man teaching it was Peter Calhoun, who was an Episcopalian minister here in Atlanta, the Reverend Peter Calhoun. So he's sitting opposite us. I'm sitting about, 10, 12 feet away from him, and my date's standing behind me, and I'm drinking my usual Coca-Cola. I didn't drink alcohol much. It was usually Coca-Cola back then. And while I'm watching him, he's got his black, clergy outfit on with the, and sitting, a white collar, and he's sitting there. And I'm very relaxed and just listening to very intently what he's talking about. And I see him change. And I'm like, what's in this Coke anyway? But he went from being a young man to being a very old woman. And his hair suddenly had turned white and was piled up and came up in a bun and back. And he had a black taffeta dress with a high neckline and big, the sleeves that puffed and then came down. And so that was probably out of 1880s or 90s, something like that. And I couldn't move. I'm like, am I losing my mind here at this party with about 30 people? So I thought, I'm going to take a sip of my Coke. This will get me out of it. Well, I took a sip of Coke and I still saw the same thing. And I was sort of frozen. I felt like I couldn't move. When he finished his talking, then I could move. I was released from whatever. I get up and I go over and I said, Peter, I just saw the strangest thing. I don't know what it was, but maybe you can explain it. So I told him what I had seen. And he said, you are not the first person to see that. I don't know if it's me in another life or if it's a guide, somebody who works with me who's coming through or superimposing, and that's who you're seeing. But he said, you're not the first to see that. And I said, oh, may I join your group? I need to know more about all of this. And he said, well, we've got 30 people, and that's really more than is a comfortable size. But if you'll start a group, I'll teach you. And I said, well, how many do I have to get? And he said, at least 10. I got 20 people, including men and women. It was about 50-50 men and women, including an executive from Coke and what have you. So these were solid people and not airy-fairy like you would think with palm reading and healing and trying to move the object, psychometry, where you would hold something to pick up on it and all. And so we studied with Peter for several years. And it helped open up your chakras and your tuition and all. And I know at night sometimes I had a chest opposite the bed on the wall across from me. And sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would be wide awake, or I'd get up and get a drink of water or something, and there would be a lovely vase of roses sitting there. Well, when daylight came the next day, those roses were not there. So I guess my guides, as I was tuning in and all, were bringing me roses. And Peter would have us do exercises to try and either tune into our own past life or see other people's past lives. And I started doing that. It was amazing to see somebody change, and I could see a different face, different clothes, different everything. And I was really getting into this, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, I still went to my Baptist church and I still believed in my Baptist principles and all, but I knew there was another world out there too, this world of metaphysics. And one day, I was helping a company that was in town, and I met this CEO, and we were in an elevator, and we were talking about this, and he said, "Well, what do you pick up on me?" When I looked at him, I suddenly saw him back in Italy in the Renaissance days, and the days of the Medici and all the beautiful parties they had and the wonderful clothes they wore. And so I told him, I said, "You're dressed differently. This is what you're wearing." And he looked at me sort of strangely. He said, "It's very interesting you bring that up. I love that time frame. I read about it, and I have read The Prince by Machiavelli 6 times. And of course, that was about the Medici family." And I said, "Well, I think you were one of the Medicis in that life. It came through really strong." And so I, I developed a reputation for it. I was never comfortable with taking money one-on-one, so I didn't. I only took money once, and that was years later. But if people wanted to hire me for parties as entertainment, and they took it as such, don't take it too seriously. Take whatever you get, and I would do that. And I also was learning to read the tarot cards and some of the other decks of cards. And we were having a fundraiser at the home of English Thornwell, one of our friends in our group. We were all members of the ski club and the Young Republicans and the groups that had all the parties in town. Didn't matter if you were a Republican or not. We were having a grand time with our parties. And so I'm reading the tarot cards, and another friend was reading palms, and I said, "I'll do the cards to do a little variety." And this woman sat down. I didn't know her. And all of a sudden, as I'm reading the cards, you made a wish, and we laid out 5 cards. And while she's shuffling, I said, "You're wishing you were pregnant." And I blurted out, it came out of me. I had no control. I said, "You are pregnant, but you're going to have a miscarriage. You're not going, this is not going to go to full term." And she just looked at me, eyes wide, her face turned white. And I thought, I should never have said that, but it came out. I wasn't consciously saying that. It just was there. So poor thing, she was so shocked. I said, "Let me look at your hands. I'm on much safer ground than I am with the cards." And I said, "Well, I still see the same thing, but you're going to lose this baby, but you are going to have another one very quickly after that. It will be a little boy, and everything will be fine." So I said, "I don't know why that other came out, but you do have a beautiful son in your future." I later became friends with her and her husband, and she told me when I got through with the reading, she said, "You're telling me I'm pregnant, and I'm not even sure myself. I just went to the doctor this week, and he said it was a little too early to tell, but but we'll know, when the tests come back and all in a week or two, whatever." I see her several months later at a Christmas party, and I said, "Oh, how are you? And what did you ever find out?" And she said, "Well, I was pregnant. You were right. You knew it before the doctor even. And I did have the miscarriage." And I said, "The other child is coming. It's a little boy. It's on the way." So she was very glad to hear that. But I learned from that experience to really try and control and not just let something come out of my mouth really fast like that. So I had to put a lid on it sometimes. But I really enjoyed reading palms. I think I gave a lot of people a lot of helpful information. And so that was my introduction to that. And then Betty Jason, who worked with me at the library, also could read palms. We had several of us at the library who were good at that. And we were at a big library convention in Chicago, and a classmate of mine from Florida State at this point was either the dean of the library division at Kentucky or Louisiana. He had both jobs, but I don't remember which one. And he said, "Would you come read the palm of this friend of mine and see what you tell him?" And he said, "We want you and Betty both to read, but separately, and we don't want you to hear what the other one says." So I go read this gentleman's hand, and then Betty goes and reads this gentleman's hand. And we tell him pretty much the same thing. One of the things we saw was a lot of children. He had 9 children. I knew nothing about him. Turned out he was the head of Demco, which sold library furniture and supplies, and he became a very dear friend. And he was so impressed with the two of us tell him at this that the following year, we're in New Orleans for the big Southeastern Southwestern Library Association joint conference, and there are 10,000 librarians in New Orleans. And they said, would you and Betty, if we pay all of your expenses, would you come and read poems for us? Because they had a big exhibition, and people would be waiting to talk to their salesman, and they thought we could entertain them while they're waiting so that they didn't just walk off and miss an opportunity. Well, little did any of us know it was going to be so popular. She was going to read in the morning and me in the afternoon and switch the next day and all. Well, we got there the first day. We went just so we could both check the site out. And there were people already lined up because they had been promoting this. And we looked at each other and we said, we can't leave either one of, we each said, we can't leave you alone. I'll stay. So we stayed all morning, took a lunch break, and stayed all afternoon. And they had 100, 150 people lined up the entire time. And they loved it because while they're waiting to have their poem read, and they said, now you have to go fast. But we're like, well, we can only do so much so with a certain amount of time. But we're trying to read these poems and tell the people, but we were really zapping in on people. It was amazing how much correct information we were both getting. And people were hearing about this, so the line was out the door, and they were so happy about that. But it was funny because we dressed up like gypsies. We had the makeup, the jewelry, the outfit on. We decided let's really hype it up and give them a show for their money. I mean, they're paying for everything. They took us to every top restaurant in New Orleans, and they took us to hear Pete Fountain and Al Hurt, and they treated us like queens. Put us up at a beautiful little boutique hotel, the Saint Louis in the quarter and all. And so, yeah, we wanted to really give them their money's worth. And we had taken our own time from the library. Our boss thought it was great that we were getting popular out there. And so they said, you're on your own vacation time, so you don't have to go to meetings and all. You can just do this. Well, one of the things we did was a party. They had a big suite at the hotel, and people were coming by. And so they wanted us to read for that. So we said, sure, we will be glad to do that. So we're at a cocktail party before that. The library world has a lot of parties. It used to be a great fun time. So we're there, and I'm talking to Venable Lawson, who's the dean at Emory University of the library school and had been my professor at Florida State, and Don Foose, who had been a classmate of mine. He's the one who ended up dean at LSU and dean at Kentucky in there. And we're talking to them, and a third man who was standing there whom they knew. And this man said, well, would you like to go have a drink afterwards, when the party's over? And Betty and I looked at him, and I said, well, I'm sorry, but we have to go work at this hotel. We have an engagement over there. And so we're working tonight. He thought we were working as hookers with all this makeup on and all this fancy clothes. So he thinks we're two hookers. Not only that, but when we got in the cab to take us over to the convention center that first morning, the cab driver's like, he takes one look at us, and here we are at 8 a.m. with makeup all over and jewelry all over and what have you. And he's like, now, if you ladies are interested, I can send some business your way, and I'll be glad to take you anywhere. If you want to go out to Chapatulas or whatever, at no charge, I'd be your free driver, and I'll be glad to send lots of business your direction. Betty was married at the time. I was single, and Betty had married right out of college. I had been floating around as a single woman at this point for several years. And I said, she's like, isn't that nice of him? I said, Betty, I don't think he's talking about just free rides for us and all this business he's going to send us as John's that he's going to dig up. And I said, he thinks we're hookers. Well, then we were sitting having breakfast one morning on our lovely, charming patio and fountain outside of our room. And some people that are sitting at another table come over, and some men, and they come over and introduce themselves, and they too think we are hookers. Well, about then, a man we know who happened to be in the library world and who knew who we really were came over, Nancy, Betty, blah, blah, blah. And he knew these men, and they said, "Oh, you know them?" He said, "Yeah, they work for the Atlanta Public Library. Nancy's head of a branch, and Betty's head of another branch, and they're just doing this for fun." And it turned out they too, from our demeanor and appearance, nothing we were doing, but from the way we were dressed, thought we were hookers. So it just goes to show you can't tell a book by its cover, because we definitely were not hookers. And the Demko enjoyed it so much, and they got such good feedback from all the stuff we were telling people, that they hired us the following year to come to Las Vegas for the big National Library Convention. And they put us up at a wonderful hotel. They said, go see whatever shows you wanted to see. We went and saw Liberace, and we went and saw Jack Jones, the singer, and we had a grand time, and it was all paid for. And again, we were using our own time for that. But you know, we were librarians, but you can't tell a book by its cover. And we were not dressed and looking like librarians, so we had dual lives, I guess you would say. But I learned a lot about metaphysics. I learned that the information I was getting was not strictly from lines and palms. That was just my way of focusing on the person. And I would tell people, I said, it's like a radio dial that you're tuning. I'm in a room, there are a lot of people, so a lot of vibrations and energy and thoughts and all. And I have to have a way to focus on the person I'm reading. And so my dial that I tune is looking at the hand. And as I'm focusing on the lines in the hand and everything about the hand, that is how I'm tapping into your energy field so that I can tell you things about you. And so that is there's much, much more about me and metaphysics in my book, but that's a little introduction to it uh, for my little talk here today. Some of you know this about me, and some of you are probably quite surprised to hear this about me, as I don't talk about that a lot. I've done it quietly, but I used to promote it when I was having fun at parties and all, but anyway, so this may be a little tidbit you don't know about Nancy Hart Battaglia. But you'll find out lots of interesting stories that relate to this in my book. Blame It on the Full Moon. And you can see why I chose that title and why I feel the full moon has influenced me so much, because of the strange and unusual things that have happened to me in my life and that I do. And thank you for being here today. I will see you the next time. Bye.